Nowhere is the idiom, "a little knowledge is a dangerous thing," more apt than in the study of the Jack the Ripper case, and straight away I've proved the point, by misquoting an oft misquoted quote, since what Alexander Pope actually wrote in his 1711 poem, An Essay on Criticism, was, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." However, so ingrained is the belief that the actual quote is, "a little knowledge is a dangerous thing," that, had I not said anything, few viewers would have noticed my opening misquote, and even fewer would have bothered to check the source to see if what I was actually saying was correct. Which makes the oft misquoted quote the perfect opener for a video about disinformation, as it demonstrates the importance of always checking the source of a quote or a fact. But back to the Jack the Ripper case. People love to comment and proffer their opinions, and that's exactly how it should be. After all, we all have opinions, and every one of us has the potential to bring something new to the subject, so it's always been my opinion that everyone is entitled to express their opinion and should be allowed to do so without let or hindrance. However, time and time again, people have a tendency to present their opinions as facts, and this is something that should be objected to and called out every time it happens, not just when studying Jack the Ripper, but in all aspects of life. As financier Bernard Baruch put it in 1946, "Every man has a right to an opinion, but no man has a right to be wrong in his facts, nor above all to persist in errors as to facts." Sadly, social media has managed to blur the boundary between fact and opinion, or of fact and speculation. A person might be drawn into an echo chamber from which they acquire a little knowledge, often in the form of disinformation circulated by someone with a specific agenda, and they will then go on to spread that misinformation as established fact, and when challenged will either ignore the challenge or rebuke the challenger with the time-honoured mantra favoured by most of those who have drunk the Kool-Aid of disinformation: "I'm entitled to my opinion," or "we'll have to agree to disagree." As more and more people have access to more and more information and knowledge thanks to the World Wide Web, more and more of us find ourselves in danger of being manipulated by self-proclaimed influencers who have specific agendas, and who see such awkward things as actual facts as inconvenient obstacles to be brushed aside, whilst experts who have knowledge of a subject are contemptuously dismissed by them and their followers as haters or losers. And such is the manipulative nature of social media that these influencers soon acquire an almost cult-like following, members of which lap up and propagate the manipulated details and faulty reasoning being pushed, and it isn't long before fake news and alternative facts are reaching wider and wider audiences, many of whom, to return to the idiom of "a little knowledge being a dangerous thing," accept the false claims without question. In the case of Jack the Ripper, this disinformation mostly occurs with those who favour a particular suspect. It's amazing how people often proclaim themselves as being with or in team this suspect or camp that suspect. These camps or teams are often headed up by a handful of people who twist facts, manipulate evidence, and even tell outright untruths to make their case against their suspect. A favoured tactic is to rope in a few experts who help validate their falsehoods, either because they are implicit in them, or more often because they have been presented with selective and manipulated evidence. It is noticeable that whenever such an expert appears in a documentary to validate a piece of information or to adjudge the guilt of a suspect, the viewer is rarely, if ever, shown the details that were provided to that expert talking head to enable him or her to form their opinion. Theories and distortions of history are then swallowed by followers who see no reason to question them, and therefore don't bother to do their own research in order to establish if what they have been told is actually accurate. Armed with this little knowledge, these disciples will then spread out across social media and leave comments that demonstrate that they have clearly been manipulated by disinformation and really do not understand the history of the subject they are talking about. There is a delicious irony in watching those who have gone out of their way to promote a particular suspect by using disinformation and distortion become indignant when the proposer of an alternative suspect uses those same tactics to promote that rival. However, it is somewhat disheartening when the mainstream media picks up on a story that is blatantly and provably false and gives it a huge amount of uncritical coverage. This has happened recently with the story of the shawl on which DNA was supposedly found that proved a match for the DNA of descendants of Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski, proving, so it is claimed, that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. Just to reiterate, DNA has not proved that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, and the claims being made to that effect are provably false. Indeed, all you have to do is head over to the American Journal for Forensic Sciences website, the scientific journal in which the claims were published following a supposed peer review, and you will see that the journal has placed an expression of concern on the very paper in which the claims were made, on the grounds that the publisher and editor-in-chief made every effort to obtain from the authors the original data from the mitochondrial DNA analysis. However, the authors stated that the data were no longer available due to instrument data failure and other complications. In other words, the scientists responsible were asked for the scientific data or evidence to back up their claims, and they were unable to do so because they claimed to have lost the data. However, this didn't stop newspapers and TV channels from falling for the claims, and earlier this year it was being excitedly announced that the Jack the Ripper case had finally been solved and the case was closed. Renowned scientists were largely ignored by the media since, spoilsports that they were, they had a nasty habit of pointing out the major scientific flaws in the claims, and when those with the knowledge to understand the science actually got to appear on TV and counter the claims, they were contemptuously dismissed by members of the DNA cult. As one commenter put it, having watched a video in which an expert on DNA had pointed out the flaws in the DNA evidence, "People like this so-called expert don't apply basic common-sense reasoning. Of course, sometimes these experts can be so smart it actually makes them quite dumb." In one of my recent Q&A videos with Steve Blomer, we were asked about the shawl and the DNA evidence, and both Steve and myself pointed out the errors and inaccuracies in the claims being made. We got comments from people who told us that we were wrong, that the DNA had proved the Ripper's identity beyond doubt, and that DNA doesn't lie. Most of these commenters demonstrated that they actually didn't understand DNA, and a few of them even showed that they hadn't actually read the book in which the claims were made. For example, almost all of them stated that the shawl belonged to Catherine Eddowes, whereas Russell Edwards, author of the very book in which the DNA claims are made, states that it didn't belong to Catherine Eddowes, but rather was taken to Mitre Square by Aaron Kosminski. Of course, when discussing provenance for evidence, it is massively important that you understand where an item or article actually came from. As for little knowledge being a dangerous thing, it is more than apparent that many of those who believe the DNA claims possess a limited understanding of the Jack the Ripper case, since a few of them managed to mix up the shawl with the piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, which was found in a doorway of Wentworth dwellings on Goulston Street. One of the best examples of being misinformed about the facts is this comment that manages to be contemptuously dismissive of experts whilst also demonstrating a total lack of understanding about the facts of the case on the part of the commenter. Why is it that none of the so-called experts actually bother to read up on the shawl? The shawl was not found on Mitre Square. It was found at Goulston Street where the famous graffito was. The killer used it to wipe his hands and threw it away. So no, the shawl was never claimed to be found in Mitre Square. It was never claimed to be found next to the body of Eddowes. It was always said to have been found on Goulston Street. Interestingly, the commenter has managed to be both right and wrong about the shawl. It most certainly was not found in Mitre Square because there was no shawl in Mitre Square. We know this because the police did a detailed inventory of everything found on or near the body in the immediate aftermath of the murder, and no shawl was mentioned in that inventory. But as for the commenter's assertion that the shawl was never claimed to be in Mitre Square, well, that is exactly the claim that is being made by those who push the idea that DNA found on the shawl has proved that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. So it's not the so-called experts who have not actually bothered to read up on the shawl, it is the commenter. This post is a perfect example of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. The writer obviously knows that something was found in the doorway in Goulston Street, and is also aware that it was in the doorway that the graffito, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was found. But he or she has mistakenly assumed that the item found was the shawl about which the current DNA claims are being made. In fact, it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron that was found in the doorway in Goulston Street, and the killer had indeed used it to wipe his hands. However, that piece of apron has long since disappeared. In fact, it may well have been destroyed by the police at the time. So the poster of this comment has confused the apron with the shawl, and it is apparent reading the comments under the newspaper articles and news channel coverage of the DNA claims that quite a few other people have made the same error. This perfectly illustrates the need to question claims that are being made, not just about the Jack the Ripper case, but about everything we hear or see on websites and social media. Over and over again, I urge viewers of my videos to not take mine or anybody else's word for anything, but rather to go back to the sources and do their own research by reading the original documents. Today, this is easier than ever it was in the past, as so much information is available online, from newspaper archives, such as the British newspaper and Library of Congress archives, to official records, such as the census and other documents that can be located on the likes of Ancestry and Find My Past. Question everything is a mantra that should be followed by anybody studying anything on the internet. Combing through the dusty rows of these archives, or whatever the digital equivalent is to dusty rows, can be an educational, fascinating, enlightening, and enriching exercise, and who knows, you might just spot that elusive piece of information that brings us a little closer to solving the mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity. So to end, let me quote once more Bernard Baruch. "Every man has the right to an opinion, but no man has a right to be wrong in his facts, nor above all to persist in errors as to facts."